Episode 6 is the first of a two-part series of interviewing. But before we got into that, we started by James and I sharing our experiences on rejection in the job search. It's something that's happening to all of us, and so we wanted to share our experiences. We then got into interviewing, where we delved even deeper into what an ideal interview structure is, what's happening on the other side, and what a hiring manager is receiving on their side, how to properly prepare for an interview with questions, and how to research properly to really maximise your chances of going well and building great rapport with interviewers. So loads of content packed into this episode. I hope you find it useful. Enjoy. The job market has changed since the pandemic, and so have the rules.
What worked 3 years ago no longer works. There's so much more noise out there and so much contradictory advice.
We're here to help you cut past the noise and decode the new rules.
And to guide you to your next opportunity. We're going to give you our shared expertise and help you figure out how to make the most of this post-pandemic talent market.
So join us on this journey if you're open to work. Hey James.
We're back.
This is episode 6 officially of season 1, I think we're calling it.
Open to work. Season 1.
Today we're going to talk about interviewing, which is obviously a super important part of the job search process. One that a lot of people have very strong opinions about, and that we also have built these sort of systems in play in many different businesses. So it's going to be, I think, an interesting topic, of which probably is one of many times we're going to talk about this throughout the next kind of couple of seasons. But I want to just start off with sort of a story that I was hearing the other day. My wife was talking to her friend and we were having a chat about job search and the process and stuff like that. And she was saying that her husband has just been recently rejected for a job, and that he hadn't told any of his friends or his family about being rejected and not getting the opportunity. And it made me kind of think about this podcast and our experiences about being rejected and how challenging it is for, especially I think, men in this world who haven't kind of had the opportunity to share their feelings and who aren't supported in sharing their feelings. This can kind of be a bit of a space to talk about that and to be a bit vulnerable and to show kind of that it is challenging and support people on that journey who maybe aren't necessarily super open about their experiences that they're going through, but are potentially struggling. Because it is being told you're not good enough for anything, making you feel like you're not good enough is not a nice process. And it's one that, unfortunately, when you go through a job search process, you are told almost every single day. I know that you've obviously been going through job searches recently, so I'd love to hear your how you felt maybe when you recently maybe didn't get an opportunity that you were going for.
Sure. I think the most important thing for people to hear is that when you are, and whether it's being rejected for a job before you even get to an interview, or being rejected for a job after you've been through the interview process, right? It's not that you are not good enough. And it's not that other people are better than you either. It's just that you didn't get hired in this instance. And I think that's a really important nuance, because to your point, it can feel like this is because I am not good enough. I'm not smart enough. I'm not experienced enough. I don't have the right pedigree. None of that is true. And I know professionally, from sitting on the other side of the desk for 20 years now, hired literally hundreds of thousands of people around the world. I know for sure that it isn't necessarily the most qualified or quote unquote the best, however we're trying to define that person, that gets the job. That's not how it works. However, when it's me sitting on the other side of the desk getting rejected from going through the process, that's not how it feels. Even in my rational mind, when I know what's going on, it can still feel like the worst kind of rejection. The job search process, whether you want it or not, is an extended lesson in resilience. Learning not to take it personally and not to internalize it, because there are so many different variables at play during the interview process that you have no control over.
James, tell us about our American sponsor.
Many of the legacy ATS products don't use AI in any meaningful way, which is what is so innovative about mojohire.ai. It is an overlay that you can add to your existing ATS that helps you better discover candidates that are already there and reduces discovery time by up to 90%. Their comparative AI tool is a real game changer, and you can learn more at mojohire.ai.
And I talk about this idea about world building. When we apply for new jobs as the candidate, you have to, in order to prepare effectively for the role, you have to imagine what your life is going to be like. Can I do that commute? What would it be like to work with that person? Would I enjoy myself? Is this, am I going to have enough money to be able to behave the rest of my lifestyle? So you start to create this new world for a new universe that you're going to exist in if you get that job. And so then when you don't get it, you actually can grieve over the experience of that world is no longer exists. That future you planned for yourself now has disappeared. It's the same with getting made redundant. The hardest thing about, in some respects, in getting made redundant and not getting opportunities sometimes isn't that you didn't get an opportunity that you wanted and you feel rejected. It's that you built a world for yourself that you're now no longer going to experience. And that is heartbreaking in some respects, especially if it's something you really wanted.
100%. It hits in so many different ways. The further you get through the process, the more invested you
Yeah.
become and the more effort you put in. Like, it takes effort to
Mm.
apply to a job. It takes effort to prepare for the first round interviews. It usually takes even more effort to prepare
Yeah.
for second round interviews. And then if it gets to on-site interviews and you have to do a presentation, by that point, you've invested a lot of time and effort in the
Mhm.
process. And then, to your brilliant point, you're also imagining, what if? What if this happens? What will my life look like? I like that world building. What will my new world look like? And the reality is, if you're not working right now, there's also that additional pressure of this will also provide a paycheck, which then it's not just about the top of the pyramid stuff. It's about the bottom of the pyramid stuff, like food, shelter, like it's going to provide safety. And
Yeah.
then in turn, it's going to provide, yes, we can go on vacation. And yes, we can do those projects at home. And then if you don't get the job, all of those things go away. All of the
Yeah.
effort is wasted. All of the emotional investment is wasted. That world that you built has been taken away. It's a tough, tough process.
And you go back into the start of that loop where you go, I don't know where that next piece of income is going to come from. Like, I think that's also part of the challenge of it, is that you have to start all over again. And many times when you're at final stage of an interview process, you often you're not hedging your bets, but there's just reality is you're investing enough time and effort and there's not as many new leads coming through that, for you to speak with. And so if you don't get that job, you have to go right back to scratch. And the first moment that you have is like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Like food, shelter, that stuff. You have to think about that all over again. And you were so close in your mind to being able to solve those problems. And it's a zero-sum game. And you now have to try and find and build up all your leads and your confidence and mental fortitude all over again. And I think that roller coaster is what is, potentially part of the challenge of this as well. I was talking to another recruiting leader this week, and I joked that every recruiting leader or every recruiter should at some point have to go through a job search process extensively without having a job at the time. Because I just think the level of like empathy and reflection you have on like the talent acquisition space as a whole and like the process that recruiter goes through it, like candidate goes through and like the emotional challenge of it. If everyone had to do that, including like C-suite levels of parts of businesses, I think the entire talent acquisition space would be extraordinarily more empathetic. It would be a much, much better candidate experience. It would have a huge amount more investment, especially if the people at the top, I'm talking like CPOs, CEOs, were having to do this. They would really empathize with the population at large in such a different way.
I'd like to believe that will happen, but I'm not sure that it will.
I don't think it will, but that's my like. Yeah, but I think in the theory of the world, right? Like if they did, if people were forced to do that somehow, I don't know how we would do it in a fair and equitable way, but I think people would be better. I think I'm going to be a better recruiting leader and a more empathetic, candidate-driven recruiting leader the next role that I get as a result of this experience.
Oh, me too, for sure. Um, Maybe I'm just more cynical. I think that if the experiences that politicians have in their own lives would make them more compassionate in how they govern, but that doesn't always seem to work.
Yeah.
And I think I have even less faith in the capitalistic system. But here we are.
If you're a recruiter and you're in a role, hopefully listen to this and like hopefully it's an opportunity for you to re-engage with the challenges if you haven't had the opportunity to do so far, because of how busy you've been in reality of because you're in a role in recruiting and your team's been downsized, and I really empathize with that. But also sharing kind of the empathy with like just how difficult it is for a job seeker right now, and like those extra day over the weekend, especially if you have like a Friday afternoon to clear out and make sure you've spoken to candidates and given them the feedback and rejected them so they're not sitting with it over the weekend. It's such a horrible experience doing a Friday afternoon interview and then having to just reflect on it over like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday feels so long if you don't hear feedback. So yeah, I guess it's just a PSA. If you're a recruiter, if you're in a role right now, please, come back to your candidates within 24, 48 hours if you can. And if you're a hiring manager listening to this and you're an interviewer, try and submit your feedback really quickly because it means so much to the candidate on the other side. And I think I'd be speaking for thousands, if not millions of people out there when I say that.
I think, unfortunately, a lot of us came into recruiting and HR for the first part of the title, right? The human in the human resources. And in the post-pandemic world, that human part is missing a lot for various reasons. And I think that's why everyone's finding it really difficult,
Yeah. So Alderson James are one of the leading people and talent agencies. Since 2013, they've been responsible for over 1,000 people and talent hires, including one in a company that I used to work at. They helped me hire my head of technology TA. So I know the guys there pretty well. They've been responsible for scaling some of the most innovative companies in the UK and the EU. Also recently just launched in the US. So even folks in your neck of the woods now, James, can get involved for contingent, retained, and executive search. And they also now do embedded through AJX. So they can do it all. What is an interview? Like, what's actually happening on the other side? Because there is like what should be happening, what is happening. So tell me a bit about what's your perspective on like what's happening on the other side.
So if we think about the overall value chain and how people get hired, right? From aware to interested to apply / source to selection to hire to onboard. The selection process is right where the interview sits. And before you even get to interview, there might be other parts of the selection process that might be some form of assessment or some kind of coding test or what have you. But by the time you get to the interview, the universe of candidates has been whittled down into what should be the viable pool that we're going to be able to make a selection from. So the stakes are higher for everybody. And what's so interesting about the interview process is it's the most labor intensive part of the process and therefore the most expensive. It's the most difficult to administer. It's the legally the riskiest part of the process and the hardest to defend. And despite all of these things, it's also almost entirely subjective. And that's the awful truth. There is no right way, right outcomes from an interview process. And even with the most well developed, well crafted interview tools, interview process, trained hiring managers, trained interview panelists, trained administrators, like even in that perfect universe, which is very, very rare, let me be clear, even inside Fortune 500, even in that world where everything is perfect, where everything is rigorous, where everything is calibrated, you could put the same person through the same process 3 months apart and get to entirely different outcomes.
Yeah.
And that's the really unfortunate truth of interviewing, is that there's no precision there at all. It's really, really subjective. And I don't think we talk about this enough. And basically, it's kind of luck. It's the luck of the day, like how you show up, how they show up, and whether the chemistry happens. Sure, you can prepare. Sure, you can expect what kinds of questions are going to come. But there are so many variables outside of your control as a candidate, as an interviewer, me as someone running the process. What you think is going to happen often ends up completely 180. The candidate you think that's going to clinch it is not. And the candidate that you maybe think is number 2 or number 3 ends up shining. There are so many variables. And I think as tough as it is, that's the thing that you have to take away from it, that if it doesn't go your way, it's almost certainly not your fault and almost certainly got nothing to do with what you bring, like, the experience that you've had, your pedigree, where you've worked, what you've done, where you went to school, all of that. Doesn't matter, doesn't really matter when it comes to the interview. And that's also why I feel like the folks that are preying on job seekers with their hacks and tips and tools and how you can win an interview, it's all nonsense because there are so many human variables that nobody can sell you a way to hack
Yeah.
this. You just can't do it because there are so many things that you're not in control of.
It definitely does. And I think it's interesting, like from a recruiting methodologies perspective, like structured interviewing is scientifically kind of shown in combination with work samples to be one of the best ways to predict future success. However, even with that knowledge, and we've known that since the 90s, so few businesses really do this around the world. And so few businesses really enable and train hiring leaders and interviewers around the world to do this really properly and can audit and can really confidently say that they are doing this, doing even just like the basics of structured interviewing effectively. And by structured interviewing, I mean they come in with a goal. An interviewer is coming in with a goal of what they're trying to, a skill set they're trying to assess you for specifically, and can confidently say based on a consistently used list of questions that they're, and a rubric that they're scoring you against and all that sort of stuff, that you are good or not good at a certain skill set and capability.
Yes, and I love to go to the data. So let's talk about that.
Oh
So,
yeah.
yes, in the perfect universe that you describe, where the organization has very clearly defined what are the skills and competencies that equal success inside that organization, when that the heavy due diligence around that has been done, we know what success looks like inside Apple, inside Facebook, inside Google, and we can then very clearly tie those competencies to interview questions in a very structured way. And when everybody has been trained on how those interview tools work, how to ask the questions, how to calibrate the responses to those questions, and then how to score candidates based on that very rigorous interview rubric. Even when all of that happens perfectly, the predictive confidence interval for that type of interview is 76%,
Hmm.
which means 24% of the time we still don't get good signal. So even in the most perfect universe,
Yeah.
you're only getting 75%. You're only getting it right 3/4 of the time. And as you describe, even in very, very wealthy software companies where all that stuff is supposed to happen, it doesn't, because interview panelists don't show up to the internal training to learn the tools, or they don't use the tools consistently. So it never even happens 76% of the time. It probably happens 50% of the time that the interview goes well, which is why there are countless blogs of I interviewed at Apple 5 times and only got in on the fifth time, or I interviewed at Amazon 6 times. Nothing changed other than it was all just so random. It was all
Yeah.
just so random. Unless you were interviewing 6 times over the course of a 30-year career, then sure, you're very different at year 25 than you were at year 15. But
Yeah.
if you interview 6 times over the course of a year, nothing has changed about you or what you can do. It just goes to underline how totally random it all is.
Yeah.
Even in a
It,
perfect world where everyone's
yeah.
doing what they're supposed to do, it's still random.
I would wager, and this is complete conjecture, that less than 5% of interviews ever happen in the way that, and panels, I guess, happen in the way that we as recruiting leaders in an ideal scenario would want them to be happening, even when we've done the training and enablement across the business. I would say, like, if 5% of interviews around the world right now are happening in a way that we've just talked about as a perfect scenario, I'd be really surprised. And so I think with that knowledge, and we could be really, maybe really generous and say it's 20%, but even then it will be a massive minority. And so, like, with that knowledge, then how do we then engage with that as a candidate and prepare for what is a kind of an innately random process, potentially, that we don't know really what's gonna come on the other side of it.
It's easier said than done, but it is a helpful mental exercise to go through all of this framing before you go into the interview. And what I mean by that is by the time you as the candidate get to the interview process, as we've already discussed, you're really invested, you're quite far in the process, you've started to believe that this could be a thing. To your point, you're doing your world building. And as a result of all of that, it's totally natural. But as a result of all of that, we can start to um, overemphasize the importance of the interview and like build it up into a bigger thing than it's going to be, and therefore become more nervous around it. And I think it's helpful to take a more pragmatic and realistic view. Expecting too much out of an interview process, you're almost setting yourself up for failure.
Yeah.
It's a conversation between two people. And the best thing that you can do is show up as your authentic self and try
Mm.
and make a human connection. That is the best thing that you can do, in my view.
And I think what we're not saying is, as a result of it being a little bit random and you sort of having to, and anything could happen on the day, that you just don't need to prepare or put any effort in to get yourself ready for this.
No, no, no. You still need to
Yeah,
prepare, of course.
exactly. Yeah, yeah, yeah. What do you recommend candidates do to prepare for an interview? And let's start like maybe high level, and then we can go into like certain specifics potentially either later or another time.
You obviously need to uh, have a good familiarity with the company that you're interviewing with and where they sit amongst their competitive set. If the company is publicly traded, then you can read their annual report, you can read their quarterly filings, and there's a lot of the overarching strategy and market positioning is in there, straight from the horse's mouth. And even if the company is not listed, because it's smaller, rather than doing just broad Google searches, look in credible sources for information about the company. And by credible sources, I mean the Harvard Business Review, The Economist, the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal. And
It's very likely that for like a junior role, I think, especially for a junior role, but almost any, they'll ask you what you think the business does. And I used to do this quite often, especially for a junior person, because I just want to make sure that they've actually done a baseline level of research and could articulate what they're like anything about the company at all.
yeah, and not just so you can show up feeling confident in the interview, but just for your own due diligence that you can be sure that
Yeah,
this is actually somewhere that you want to
yeah.
work. You're going to be spending 40 hours a week for the next 2 to 3 years, all being well at this company. So really making sure that it's somewhere you want to work and it's an industry that you want to grow in is a really good first step, even if it's just for yourself, not for the interview process. And then
Out of
the next
interest, have you ever
stage,
done research and then withdrawn from a process based on the research that you've done?
when I was more junior in my career, I did research where there was significant red flags and I ignored it. And then I stayed at the company for only a year and a half for that reason. So I learned my
Yeah.
lesson eventually.
I went through a process where I found out that they were having like really significant employee relations issues, and they were going through like a massive legal case. And when I met their CPO, I asked them about this, and they weren't super happy that I had even brought it to them at all. And I think I wouldn't have if I hadn't done, like, it wasn't on the top tier of Google searches when I started looking at this company. I had to like dig a bit deeper, and I think it obviously massively influenced. I didn't get the job obviously, but they also didn't want me to know about it, which I thought was really interesting.
You dodged a bullet.
Dodged a bullet. Very happy to not be working there. So,
So, research on
part
the
two.
company. Number one
Yeah.
can be even more crucial thanks to your story.
Yeah.
I can tell you why you don't want to work there, not just why you do. But then it's also a really good idea to uh, do like high level research on everybody that you're meeting with. And what I mean by that is just looking at the LinkedIn profile of the 3 or 4 people that are going to be interviewing you so that you can understand A, how long they've been with the company, and B, where they were before, what their career journey has been, and C, for anything that any potential overlap that you might have with them and their professional journey or anything that they talk about, alumni associations or interest groups or volunteering or any of that. And why is that important? It comes back to the human connection. What you're
Yeah.
trying to do in this interview, in this conversation, is form a human connection. And the sooner that you can establish rapport and common ground, the more likely it is to go in your favor. And so, you know, 10 minutes of looking at someone's LinkedIn profile, you may be able to find, you can at least find questions you can ask them about their own career journey, even if you can't find common
Yeah.
ground. And one of the most important questions you can ask is, I see you joined Apple a year ago from Google. What made you join, and what has surprised you about the culture and the environment? What's the same? What's different? What was your learning curve? You know, and people love to talk about themselves.
Yeah, I think having doing the research that you can ask a very specific question about them and their journey is also a really good way to stand up in the crowd. Like I remember interviewing, especially for again earlier career kind of candidates, and the questions that you ask can often separate you immediately from, even if you've had a bad interview, can often show that, like, because it can often separate you because you've shown that you've done a level of due diligence that is above and beyond what other people have done, and you've shown a level of curiosity and interest. And often when I'm interviewing senior candidates and executive candidates, it's often an exchange and a consultation conversation. It's let's learn about each other, let's learn about the businesses. They'll talk about how they've solved the problems that we're having, and we're going to exchange an ongoing kind of series of problems together. And because they've done a bit of research about our company, they could ask, like, I see you're at this stage of company, and you know, do you have this problem? I've gone through that problem in the past. I'm like, oh yes, we have, and it starts a whole other conversation. So being able to move away from structured interview, I'm going to ask one directional questions, to trying to find a way to bring it into a conversation and take maybe a bit of ownership over the driving seat of that conversation, can often, again, enable you to build a human connection, but also give you a platform to have a kind of demonstrate your skill sets, basically.
Exactly, to position yourself as a credible expert in the space. Like,
Mm.
you know the industry so well because you're in it and you have a point of view. And here's what I expect are issues for your organization based on your stage of development or growth. 100%.
Yeah, yeah. So we've got research the company, research the people that you're going to be interviewing with. Is there any other preparation you'd recommend?
Yes, the last thing that you need to do is have 2 or 3 questions prepared for each person, and they can be questions based on the person's own career journey, their area of specialism, if you're meeting people from different business units, or just indeed about the wider challenges the business might be facing
Mm.
based on whatever's happening in the macroeconomic environment or specifically in your industry sector, because you want to
Yeah.
look like you're informed and you've done your research and that you're organized. There's nothing worse when, and you will be asked, 85% of the time, do you have any questions for me? And if you don't, it's kind of super awkward. And
One of the ways you kind of think about asking questions about a business is to think of it like a funnel. So, what's the overall strategy? What's the strategy for this department? What's the strategy for my department? What's the strategy for the people that are underneath me? How do you tie things back to business outcomes? And starting with a question about the company and how that business unit is trying to enable that company's success, often, and understanding the overall company goal, I think, can really position you very strongly.
yes, and actually, let's continue on that theme because, like, the next level of preparation for interviews is your storytelling, right? And I deliberately call it storytelling because that's what it is, and that's what you need to practice. And there are two kinds of storytelling you need to practice. You need to get really good at your overall career narrative. What's the
Yeah.
90-second to 2-minute version of your career journey? Why did you start in the industry? Why did you make the changes that you made? Um, and it's important to practice it because it preempts any questions and allows you to control the narrative where there are parts of the narrative that you want to control. So, if you were laid off 10 years ago and there's a gap on your career, by actually just practicing that narrative and telling the story before the question is asked allows you to put whatever spin on it you want, for example. And even if there aren't things that you need to control the narrative, still having a really tight 90-second to 2-minute summary of your 10 or 15-year career journey is a really good thing to get used
Mm.
to practicing.
If you're preparing for an interview, what what three recommendations you'd give to a candidate who's preparing for an interview this week?
Yeah, it's really simple. The three things you need to do are, first of all, research the company. And again, credible places, their investor relations site, if they have one, their SEC filings, if they're listed. If the company is not listed, then other credible sources like the Harvard Business Review, the Wall Street Journal, The Economist, the Financial Times, well-respected journals that are going to give you credible levels of insight. Great place to start. So number one, research the company. Number two, research the people that you're going to meet with. At bare minimum, look at their LinkedIn profiles to see what their overall career journey was. And that can help you with your preparation of questions. Oh, I see that you joined Apple a year ago from Google. Why did you make the transition? What has surprised you? What have you learned? What's been the same? What's been different? Great way to show that you've done your research, and can also be an opportunity to establish rapport, especially if you have overlaps with where you went to school, the types of volunteering that you do, the countries that you've lived in. There can be a million different things you can find that can help you establish rapport with people. And then leading into that, the third thing that you need to do is have your questions prepared, either questions about the business, questions about the individuals that you're meeting, or questions about the broader challenges the business might be facing based on what you know is going on in the industry.
In our next episode, we're going to go a level deeper here and talk about like how do you actually respond to interview questions? How do you prepare for like what you're going to say in response to certain types of questions? So that's really around the idea of like storytelling, like interviewing and good interviewers, and actually throughout your career, it's really important that you're very good at telling stories, and it's something that lots of people struggle with in the context of an interview. So we're going to dedicate a whole episode to it. That's going to be episode 7. So tune in next time. The core of this podcast of Open to Work is that we're here to help. We want to help you get your next job. We want to help you, navigate this really challenging job market. So if you're either looking for your next job, if you know someone who's looking for their next job, please share this podcast with them, like and subscribe this. We're here to help. And the more followers and engagement, and the more that you love us, the more that we can continue to support and love you and help you navigate this really tricky time. So follow us on Open to Work Pod. Wherever you get your podcasts, and you can email us as well at opentoworkpod@gmail.com.
Or even better, you can interact with us on TikTok.
Oh yeah, we're on TikTok now. Open to Work Pod on TikTok as well, and we're both individually on TikTok. James, what's your handle? If you remember,
James Hudson knows talent. Yes, he does.
Mine's Matthew Talent Lead, and I'm increasingly jealous of
Mine's
James's.
better.
Yeah, I'm jealous of your handle. We're both on LinkedIn as well, and you can find me at Matthew Parker Advisory. But importantly, follow, like, subscribe, share this with your friends. We really want to help and enable people around the world to land their next job and navigate the challenging job market. So tune in next week because we're going to be talking about stories. Story time.
Crafting the narrative.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, James. I'll catch you next one.